Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Dr. David Wheeler Memorial Lecture in Spatial and Cancer Statistics. My name is Robert Pereira. I'm the interim chair in the Department of Biostatistics at Virginia Commonwealth University. I have the honor of introducing today's lecture, which is hosted by the Department of Biostatistics. We are gathered here today to honor the legacy of Dr. David Wheeler, an extraordinary scholar, mentor, and friend to many in our community. Today, we are especially grateful to be joined by Dr. Wheeler's family. His mother, Darlene, his sister, Dawn, and brother-in-law, Jim, are here. So glad to have him here as we honor his memory and contributions. Sadly, Dr. Wheeler passed away in 2024 after a courageous battle with brain cancer. I also want to take this moment to thank the members of the organizing committee for this event, Dr. Bernard Fumler, Dr. Nitai Mukhopadhyay, and Dr. Joseph Boyle, and the Department of Biostatistics staff, Jillian Moore and Kate Huck, for helping to make this event happen. Let me start by briefly introducing VCU's School of Public Health. Established in 2023, the School of Public Health's mission is to advance health, well-being, and longevity for all. With 4 founding departments, the school offers 4 PhD programs, 2 master's programs, and a graduate certificate. We are proud as a new school to be ranked 34th by the Blue Ridge Institute for Medical Research, with 96% of our faculty actively engaged in externally funded research, amounting to leading $9.5 million in grants aimed at addressing critical public health challenges. I look forward to seeing our rise as our school continues to grow. I also want to pass on a message from our founding dean, Dr. Vanessa Shepard, who wants to express her sincere appreciation for your presence today, recognizing the importance of this event and the significant impact that Dr. Wheeler had on our academic community. Our Department of Biostatistics was founded in 1958 and has a long-standing tradition of excellence. Our department's mission is to improve human health through methodological research, collaborations with health sciences researchers, and graduate education. We launched our PhD and MS training programs in 1969 and have since graduated 152 doctoral and 112 master's students. I'm very proud to represent our department faculty who have diverse research expertise and are known for their strong focus on genomics, contemporary clinical trial design, Bayesian analyses, and data science. Impressively, our faculty contribute to more than $130 million in sponsored research across VCU. Within the past year, we are very proud to have Dr. Nolan Wages named a fellow for the Society of Clinical Trials and Dr. Dipankar Bandyopadhyay, a fellow for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Today, we are here to honor Dr. David Wheeler, who was a professor in our department for 13 years. Dr. Wheeler's academic journey began at Syracuse University, where he earned his BA in geography. He then attended The Ohio State University, where he earned an MA in geography, an MS in applied statistics, and a PhD in geography. He also earned an MPH in quantitative methods from Harvard University and was a cancer prevention fellow at the National Cancer Institute. Dr. Wheeler was internationally renowned for his pioneering work in spatial and cancer statistics, focusing on environmental exposures and neighborhood effects on cancer incidence. He developed innovative methods to manage highly correlated exposure data and spatial relationships, and his contributions are reflected in over 100 peer-reviewed publications, more than 7,500 citations, and recognition as being in the top 2% of cited scientists in his field in 2024. He served on the editorial board of the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health and was a principal investigator on over 15 grants, mostly funded by the National Cancer Institute. Beyond his research, Dr. Wheeler was a dedicated teacher and mentor, advising 7 PhD students and serving on dissertation committees for 13 others. He also led the department's summer student training program and was recognized in 2019 for teaching the best elective course in the VCU MPH program. Outside of academia, David was known for his vibrant spirit and varied interest. He was an avid cyclist, a passionate music lover, a beer enthusiast, and skilled brewer. His energy, kindness, and dedication touched everyone around him. Today's lecture will be delivered by Dr. Lance Waller, a distinguished professor in the Department of Biostatistics and Bioinformatics at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University. Dr. Waller is widely recognized for his expertise in spatial statistics, disease mapping, and environmental epidemiology. His research has made a significant impact on understanding geographic patterns in disease distribution. He is also the co-author of the influential book, Applied Spatial Statistics for Public Health Data. Notably, Dr. Waller served as Dr. Wheeler's postdoctoral mentor, making his role as the inaugural speaker for this lecture series especially meaningful. We are honored to have Dr. Waller with us to share his insights and reflections on the field that Dr. Wheeler so passionately advanced. Thank you for being here with us to celebrate Dr. Wheeler's legacy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lance Waller.
So it's a special pleasure to be here, and David's family. He was a postdoc with me at Emory, and one of the most productive periods, I think, of my career anyway. He kept us going, always had the next paper in the hopper, and I want to show some of the impact his work had on mine, and then branch off into the world of maps. So this is a 1940s creepy map of global health. I saw a copy of this in London, did not buy it. Then one of my students found a copy on Etsy, and it hangs proudly in my office. I've worked on projects on half of these diseases now, so I guess I've got the other half to go. I was also early motivated with these. I remember these family circus cartoons where Billy or Jeffy wanders around the neighborhood and there's a dotted line and you kind of follow the story. And the best part about being in academia is someone wrote a paper about these in the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, but it was also an Ohio State professor, so I'd put that on sort of full circle. I had a great time reading that paper. It came out last year. You know, maps are important. So Maps, a Statistical View is a title that was given to me by the editors at the Annual Review of Statistics and its applications. And they just, you know, I spent 2 years with atlases and books spread over the dining room table. And I want to show a lot of things I've learned. So this is going into my office, and there's lots of maps there, and the arrows point to ones that are going to show up in this talk. So you don't have to keep score, but just letting you know that that's where they are. There's the creepy map on the left there. You've already seen that one. Okay, so David, and I want to point out again in his training, his PhD was in geography and his training in statistics. And a lot of us in biostatistics have this sort of interdisciplinary, we end up in the field, and the interdisciplinary training we have is really contributes to what we can bring. So it's not a field where you always do an undergraduate, a graduate, undergraduate, master's, and PhD in all the same field, or otherwise we would all be exactly the same. So in working with David, he had concerns looking for an academic job at first because he goes, you know, the geography department say I don't look like a geographer, and the stat department say I don't look like a statistician. And I said, well, you know, you do what you do really well, and then they realize what they're getting is more than that. And I think in following his MPH at Harvard and his postdoc at NCI, found the perfect fit for his skills and talents, and then took this department and the students here in a direction that might not otherwise have gone. So I'd like to point that out. He was insightful, creative, and disciplined, and a wonderful colleague. And since we collaborated on maps and statistics, the geography and statistics came together. I was kind of an amateur geographer then. Here's 2 of my maps from my dissertation, like before I met David. And they're really, you know, they got published, but they're not great. The map on the left, I drew the boundaries, just telling it the line segments to draw in S+. The map on the right, I actually got a clip art map of Sweden and made it different sizes till it sort of covered the dots, and then traced around it with a magic marker. And so that's hand-drawn cartography. So I think it's pretty accurate on the southern part, but on the northern part, I'm not so sure. So one of the papers that we worked on, that's not me or David in the picture. I had a student ask me what a raccoon was once, and so that was the Google image search picture I've gone with for years. But we wrote this paper in the Journal of Agricultural, Biological, and Environmental Statistics, and it was actually selected by the editors as the best paper in that journal for those 2 years. It was quite an honor. And the map on the right looks a whole lot better than the maps I made, right? And so raccoon rabies is a particular strain of rabies that's in raccoons, but it can infect cats and dogs and people. But it has spread up the eastern United States, east coast of the United States, and then it's spreading west into Ohio and so on. But it moves slowly. Things like bird flu, birds fly a long way, and it can transmit. But this started in the late 1970s at this red star was the first case. It's been endemic in Florida and Georgia for a long time, and it was slowly creeping along. But there was this event where some likely an animal that was diseased had been moved, and it started outbreaking. And these contour lines, the yellow ones, are every 24 months, every 2 years. How far did it spread? We sort of smoothed it out so you get a better picture. The green in the background is related to the elevation. It gives you the Appalachian Mountains and and then I've got the major rivers on there. And the kind of things this does without doing any statistics is just organize the data so you can think about it. And you can see it moved faster in this direction right in the corridor between these two rivers. So the raccoons weren't crossing the river, but kind of infecting ones along there. And then when you get to the Susquehanna River here, the contours are closer together. It took longer to get across there. Eventually did, but it slowed things down, went faster in the areas around it. And then once it crosses the river, it speeds up quite a bit. So there's a lot of layers of information in this one, in this figure, to bring together what are we looking for when we do the statistical model? Because are rivers speeding it up or slowing it down? It kind of depends the orientation of the river to the wavefront. The other one was a feline immunodeficiency virus in cougars. So we did some wildlife epidemiology here. And cougars had been hunted out of Montana and Idaho area, but they had been reintroduced. And they hadn't been there for very many years, but they wanted to know if there were genetically distinct subpopulations. And the feline immunodeficiency virus evolves faster than the cougar genome would. So they looked at some genetic markers on the virus. And the map on the left on the bottom here was splitting it into two groups. And there's a pretty sharp distinction here. And that was running it through the code that did all the statistics that said you're in group 1 or you're in group 2. And there's a pretty high probability you're in group 2 over here and high probability group 1 elsewhere. But that doesn't give us a lot of context until we put those same dots, although we changed the colors here, on the map that shows elevation and where the interstate highways and the river. And that distinction between the triangles and the circles here roughly follows where these two interstates are, an area of low elevation or not good cougar habitat. The cougars aren't going across this very often, or the river. And it starts to give us insight, maybe not quantitative for this analysis, but for the next analysis that we need to take into account the land cover and the kind of thing. So the map added interpretation to what we were doing. A lot of the examples I'm going to show are ones I talk about in this Maps a Statistical View paper and a paper on putting spatial statistics back on the map. You can turn the spatial statistics are often motivated by starting with data that are on our map. I want to explain the patterns that are happening, and then it turns into math. And I remember getting a book about spatial statistics that had no figures in it at all. It was all equations, and I thought, how can you possibly do that? And you can put the math in there, but it needs to come back to the map to make sense. So you are here. Here's where we'll begin. London Underground had an art exhibit for a while where every station had a different labyrinth in it. And difference between a labyrinth and a maze is a labyrinth only has one path through it. And the labyrinths in the cathedral were for the pilgrims. It's kind of like going to Disney. Like you spend half your time waiting for the ride, but it's sort of an interesting place to wait. Like the Star Wars stuff is around you. I think this is where labyrinths kind of came from. We gave people things to do while they were in line. So I have four categories I'm going to talk about. Maps fascinate us. They motivate stories, and our imagination gets lifted up by them. It makes us think about what's driving the data. Maps communicate. They can be data visualizations, and that's where a lot of people stop thinking about them, that it's just visualizing the results, but that's a really important role they play. I want to make the case they do two other things. One, that the maps integrate information, so the map itself is part of the data set that we want to take control. And then the maps evaluate. The maps are statistics themselves. If the word statistic is a summary of the data, it's a way of summarizing the data and interacting with it. And I'll talk about how the map structure gets into the equations and do an I'll have one slide with some Greek letters on it. And I'll talk about Bayesian statistics a little bit. So maps fascinate us. So many great stories start with someone coming into a smoke-filled room and going, I have in my possession a map. Right, and so you can think of the beginning of Treasure Island, this is from Peter Jackson's remake of King Kong. This is Skull Island, and there's the word fog all around it. And then there's this stain over here in the upper left that if they just turned the map the other way, they would have known what they were in for. So the stain's the King Kong face, right? This is the Treasure Island map that Robert Louis Stevenson drew first before writing the story. So he had a whole context for the story to evolve. This is from The Hobbit. I have a copy that light shines through, so the moon letters show up. So that's kind of cool. There's the secret door. Knock 3 times on the threshold. Okay, anyway. This is a version of Ptolemy's world map from that shows where wind comes from, for one. It has the angels blowing on the earth. But you can see some, so here's Spain and Italy. You can see the boot in Sicily. Africa down here, the Nile River going up. They have Africa connected all the way over to Asia. But it's also an indicator that this idea of a flat Earth on a disk really wasn't the concept. They've got this, but is it from the European notion? As you go further south, it gets hotter and hotter, and the question is, could you ever get across the equator? This is an updated version. It still has the faces blowing. There's a lot more detail out here, blowing on this. The wind in this near Antarctica is a skull now, so that's scary. And there's cannibals in South America. South America, you can see their general shape that we recognize with Peru. North America, the Yucatan Peninsula is there, but we don't see the west coast because the European cartographers had not, navigated that. So maps show us what we know, but they also show what we hope would be there. So this is a French map from the 1700s for the risk players. Here's Kamchatka and Siberia. You've got Asia's boundary pretty clear. This is Alaska, the location of Alaska. And the Columbia River goes all the way through to the Hudson Bay. So the Northwest Passage is in here, which doesn't really exist, but they were hoping it did. And so trying to tie this. It also showed me, this says indiqué pour Japanois, that Japan had a claim on the northern half of Alaska, which I hadn't known before I'd seen this map. Or what we're allowed to see, this is zooming in on, there's a big map of the Minnesota territory on the wall in my office that had an arrow pointing to it. And if you've been to Minneapolis, here's Fort Snelling, the airport in Minneapolis, St. Paul's near here, Lake Harriet, Lake Calhoun, Lake of the Isles are all urban lakes with parks around them in Minneapolis. But what's missing is Lake Minnetonka, which is a really big actual lake here. And the story goes that Nicollet, the surveyor doing this for Army Corps of Engineers, is being led by Native American guides, and that lake was a holy place for them. So they led the surveyors all around it, but never anywhere where they could actually see it. So as far as this, the data is not there, right? So they have a lake that does exist, but doesn't exist on the map. And we need to think about sometimes the information we see on our maps is a product of what's really going on and the way we measure it. So if one county is reporting a disease, we might see a lot of cases there. If another county is not reporting disease, it'll have a 0, but is that really a 0 or not? So maps communicate. We've seen these, how they motivate us, they fascinate us, and they try to draw us in what's going on here, what's going on there. But what do they show us? So when we use maps for getting from here to there, that's what we're generally familiar with. The map on the right is the metro system. We're used to sort of subway city maps like this that are not accurate maps of Washington, D.C., but it helps you use the system, right? What stop is next? But we know the blue line does not make a right angle between Franconia and Dorn Street. But it'll tell me which side of the Potomac River I'm on. And it helps me use the system, but it doesn't give me extra information. When I leave the station, I don't know generally where I am or how to get to the Smithsonian from there. But what it's done is it's distilled it down to the information I need. And it occurred to me, this is really similar to these Marshall Islands shell plots. So these are maps of the islands or little shells tied to the sticks, which represent currents. And this is how they would teach the outrigger canoe navigation, in addition to where the clouds were and the stars and so on. So it's a tactile map you could feel and memorize. But it's also cutting things down. The length of time is how long you would be in the current, not how far would you go. So I can't take this map and put it on a Google Earth image of the South Pacific and have things line up, because it's the time, it's how fast things are moving that you're keeping track of. And that's the information you wanted to know. So every map leaves things out, and it may distort the things that go in there in order to tell the story you need to tell. So maps often hold clues. And when I was a kid and I'd get a book, if it had a map in the beginning, I'm like, oh, this is going to be really good. Like the Lord of the Rings, I could follow where they would go and all this. This is a map from The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which is this long medieval murder mystery, but it was in a monastery, and the library of the monastery was a collection of information, and they were trying to figure out what organized the scrolls. And then they noticed out notice like each room had a letter on it. So this is Egypt. They were all organized by where they'd come from. So this was important. Like, where did that scroll come from that was the problem? And then, ooh, spoiler alert, there's a secret room here. So any library that has a secret door is like A-okay with me. All right. But the clues they reveal might not show up right away. So this is the first epidemiology class I took, had this example from 1926. And the map on the left is where the cases of endemic typhus lived in Montgomery. And the map on the right is where they worked. So which map is more interesting in terms of public health? Why? Why is residence more interesting? Yeah, well, what would be good about the other one? It's interesting you say that, because usually people go, I want the one that I can point to and say there's a cluster of points. That there's something in common with those cases. They have some shared exposure. And so what they were saying here is at the bend of the Alabama River, the farmers would deliver their grain and store the grain in silos. And if you put a lot of grain in one place, you also get a lot of rodents. And it led them to think, well, maybe the rats are transmitting this disease. And so we all nodded our head in our epidemiology class going, oh yeah, that's really insightful. That's what we should do. But then we realized all the data we get from the census is where people live. So the key point in these two maps is there's a relevant exposure, and the map that shows how people share the relevant exposure was more important than the map that showed where they were, where they lived. So where they slept wasn't where they were getting exposed, but where they worked probably was. And a lot of times we would have to work harder to get the map of shared exposure for for occupational exposures. And you might have to do some work to the data to see the picture. So Michael Crichton wrote The Andromeda Strain in the early 70s, is like a science fiction classic of this satellite comes back to Earth with some kind of infectious agent, and everyone in the town dies except an old man and a baby. And in this book, and he wrote this, Michael Crichton also wrote Jurassic Park later. But while he was a medical student, he wrote Andromeda Strain, which I reread recently. And the map on the left shows the Western United States. Here's where I grew up in New Mexico. And then the map on the right distorts the states based on how many people live in an area. So Los Angeles has a lot of people, so now it's bigger. San Francisco stretches this out. The Nevada, Las Vegas has a lot of people, so that takes up space. And they were trying to do this to see how many people it would have to pass through. So distance on the map on the right is related to the number of people between a location. And this is called a cartogram. And he did this by hand and did it on an IBM Selectric typewriter, he said, and then drew lines with a ruler. But he had to do some work. The idea on a cartogram is that you could see how area is going to reflect how many people are sick. Whereas on the map on the left, if it's over a city, a lot of people would be sick if there's a dot there, but if there's a dot somewhere else, not so much. So you might have to do some work to get the map to talk to you. And interpretation can be tricky. The maps, and once we know the right answer, they show up. So this is an old map of yellow fever in New York City. The gentleman who made this name was Valentine Seaman, 1798. So those of you who are looking for John Snow's map's coming, but that's 1854. So this is older than this, older than that one. What he saw, it's a little harder to read, but there's a couple of numbers where the cases were, and there's some areas where there's mosquitoes. And he said, oh, there's a concentration of mosquitoes near the cases. You're like, oh, he's going to figure out that mosquitoes are the vector of yellow fever risk and not just bad air, which the miasma theory was big, because a lot of times you'd smell rotting stuff and think the air smells bad, so it must make people sick. So his interpretation was the circumstances favoring the rise of the putrid miasmata, or the bad air, equally favor the generation of these insects. So he recognized they happened at the same place, but he didn't make the connection that maybe the risk was associated with this. And this is John Snow, and I apologize if the sound, so Carol Gotway, who wrote the book with me, at one point during our short courses inserted sound effects, and I don't usually know if I have the one with sounds or not. But anyway, John Snow, an anesthesiologist, medical doctor, lived in London during the period of cholera outbreaks in the middle 1800s. And he made several maps, but one we think about a lot is the map of cholera deaths in 1854. And this little X in the middle is on Broad Street. That was a public water pump. There are other water pumps. And Snow, if you read Snow's work, it's really modern sounding. He's keeping track of things. He's worrying about confounding type ideas without all the language that we might have, but you can sort of see a modern scientific view. So Snow maps this, does have the sound. He looks at the pump. God, it's the pump. That animation took me a whole day back in. And so I use that in every talk if I can. Okay. But it's a brilliant work. And so I'm not discounting John Snow's work and his inductive reasoning of this. But we've kind of compressed it to a fairy tale that he drew a map, he pointed at it, his eyes got bigger, he pulled that handle pump off. But what he actually did was make the maps, go to a lot of meetings. They decided to take the water pump handle off the water pump, but at kind of the decline. This is another data set from the same, or another data visualization. Tom Cook has a Cartographies of Disease book. Along the bottom here, these two big bumps are the diarrheal diseases and the cholera deaths over time. And then in the background are things like temperature, rainfall, humidity. And this is like data science in 1884, right? We're trying to see all these things and figure out what magic combination of these variables triggered the start of the outbreak. Of course, what we do with machine learning now is we have hundreds or thousands of measures in the background. We try to pick those out. It's still a hard problem, but this kind of graph was like, what was driving the number of cases? And Snow's wasn't the only map of that outbreak. So in 1854, there's some nice Brody's paper, Cook's book, Johnson's The Ghost Map. The first map they made, they started making tick marks of deaths, and you see the pump here. The pump was in the wrong place. It gets moved over a little bit. The John Snow pub today is on this corner, and they have a little pink curbstone where the water pump was. And then later you can see here at number 38, there's so many cases they had to start putting the tick marks sideways, and the water pump's nearby. My brother and I went to visit New York City a couple of years ago, and my brother was very kind and said, there's an antique bookstore that has maps. And I go, really? Can we go? And they took us upstairs in a little rickety elevator with the two of us and the operator in there. We walk out and it surprised the two people because no one was looking at maps. And I said, do you have any health maps? And they go, only that cholera one from London. And I had to put my game face on and went, oh, really? Could I take a look at that? And so this is not John Snow's map, but you can see here's the tick marks again. But the thing this has added to it that Snow's map didn't is this circle here that says erroneously supposed position of the ancient plague pit. And the red lines and the blue lines were new storm sewers that were being put in. And one of the competing theories at the time was they had drilled into a plague mass cemetery. It was about 400 years old, and the bad air was seeping in through the gully holes, through the drains. And so the people advocating for that were mapping this and saying, look, all these cases are by this drain, because if you're a city worker and you're putting in water pumps, you put the drain right next to it. So it's the same location. And so there were a lot of meetings, and Parks was one of the London Board of Health people reviewing Snow's map and so on. And you read the long part, he goes, well, he starts off, I cut this shorter, he starts off by saying, it looks like a circular area around the pump, there's higher number of cases. And you're going, yeah, he's gonna get it, just like the yellow fever one. And then he goes, well, that certainly looks more like the effect of an atmospheric cause than any other. If it were owing to the water, why should not the cholera have prevailed equally everywhere the water was drunk? So his idea was it shouldn't be around just one pump, it should be around all the pumps. Therefore, it must be something in the air. So even though Snow's answer, which we know is right, that it was caused by bacteria at that pump, if you're not looking for that, you don't see it. So they had the same data, they had a set of similar maps, but they came to completely different conclusions of what's driving it, because it's hard not to see what you're already looking for. We already have filters that we're looking for, and learning to see through those is important. So if these are all statistical graphics, can we do a good job? These maps are an interesting intersection of a couple of different fields. So we've got the field of statistical graphics, and this is Leland Wilkerson's Grammar of Graphics. So if you use ggplot, that's what the GG stands for. His Grammar of Graphics was implementing a lot of this. We've got data visualization. Edward Tufte has these beautiful coffee table books on the visual display of quantitative information. And then we have thematic cartography, and Alan McEachran. So I figured out I really know the literature really well around 1991 when I finished my dissertation. This book came out around then too, but it's a big, thick academic book on ways that cartography works, methods of visualization, but they don't always overlap each other. And so there's a lot of interesting work to do trying to bring ideas from one into the other. So one problem is if you make a really good map of bad data, it's a lot more believable than a bad map of good data. So you can dress up your conclusion. So what makes a good map? And I think it should be of good data. Let me just clarify that. From the geography field, Bertin's dissertation in 1983 was in French, but he said there's a bunch of visual variables. There are things we have control over in maps to convey meaning, like the size. You could have dots and lines and areas. You can't really make the areas bigger, but you can convey there's a lot of cases at this location with a big dot. You can use shapes to say it's a factory or a school or a church. You can show different shapes associated with different regions. You could use grayscale, color, texture. You can have arrows like for one-way streets or the stripes on the regions. And so it gives us tools we can work with. And Marc Montmonier's a cartographer, has a lot of fun books to read. One of them is How to Lie with Maps. And he made this point that the tree stamp is usually used by developers to say, oh, look, I'm going to build this building here, but it's going to be a vibrant green space because there's trees all around it. But they're all imaginary trees. And I thought, oh, who would really do that? Well, my office is in this building. The School of Nursing is next door. And this is when they were proposing to build it. And there was this mysterious building that has since been built. But the street in front of me is not lined with trees. It doesn't have a boulevard with trees every 10 feet, but that's the way they drew it. You can see there's a forest around us. So people really do that. Another thing that McEachran showed in the how maps work was that choices you make of the same data can be more easily read than others. So this is a map with 7 different layers of data. You can see some state lines back here, but other than that, it's sort of a spaghetti shape. But just by changing the way the different layers are shaped, you can start to tell them apart. You can get some of the you've got a low pressure system and you've got air pressure with dotted lines getting thicker for bigger values this way. And you've got slanted lines that are maybe clouds and slants the other way that might be the subset of rain. And you can tell where they're both happening because it turns into this. And you've got solid lines of temperature that get thinner. So all of a sudden now I can see all 7 layers, but I didn't even add color or anything. So there's a lot of these visual variables that people kind of discover and rediscover over and over again. But if you start with thinking there's ways to do this, you can have a lot of information in one map and you don't have to go to color. But when you do go to color, then Cynthia Brewer's work talks about ways to display things. So like different hues can differentiate things. This was a map that NASA made of the dark side of the moon. That's why I put the Pink Floyd album cover there. And the different colors are different ages of rock, and you can kind of quickly tell them apart. Like our yellow, the yellow ones are mostly on top of other colors. Those are probably newer craters because the meteorites hit on top of those. The blue one here is underneath everything, so it's probably older. So it's harder to tell those if they were all different grayscales. Darker shades usually mean people see darker shades, they think the number's bigger. Because you want to make a map where if I held it up and showed it to you and put it down and said, what did you see? Where are the large parts? You want people's gut reaction to generally be correct. It might not always be, but if you make a really complicated map that requires them to put their finger down and then go over to the legend with their other finger and then use their nose to follow the line, then you've kind of lost your chance to have them discover things. So what about the color spectrum? In the grammar graphics book, Leland Wilkinson says a lot of people say don't use the usual Roy G. Biv color scheme from the rainbow, but they're like, yeah, but everyone knows that order. But do you know whether yellow is bigger than green? You have to stop and fill it out again. He showed an example. He goes, you can tell here, this works just fine. But part of it is, this shows where the cities are. And it depends how you draw the lines between these colors. And if your referee says that you should rethink your color scheme, it was probably me. I don't mind if you choose one, but tell me why you chose it. These are maps, they're all the same thing. The bottom 2 have exactly the same cutoffs, but in one of them I just went from low to high with blue, and the other one I did the color scheme. And the top one I have different cutoffs where the cities really stand out a lot more. So I can choose which values to break it on to highlight the cities. I can use quantiles or percentiles to show this range, but if you use the rainbow one, Tufte calls this the ghastly rainbow. So some people like the middle map. I still think it's a little hard to read. The bottom one shows me where it goes from low to high and how much slower it is in the west than it is in the east. So the legend should be, it should be a reference, but not required to understand see the patterns that you're talking about. So that was maps fascinating and maps visualizing. Let's think about how maps come together, and the map itself is your data set. So the maps have a combination of things of the geometric space of distance, direction, and movement, and geographic space, which is something happened here, but other stuff happens here too. So you find a map and you find your house on it. You think about the temperature, you think about when you look at a weather map and you move from one city to another, it takes several months before you stop looking at where you used to live. I wonder what the temperature is where I used to live. But it also thinks about, what are the housing prices in the neighborhood? Where are the grocery stores? There's things you know about your neighborhood that place you in context. And the added value of those, it can add new ideas and hypotheses. So how does seeing something on a map happen? One of the other maps in my office is this one, which is from an atlas by Berghaus in 1854. It's supposed to be a map of mammals in North and South America, which it mostly is, but it has an inset of Austria for reasons I have no idea why that's there, and then Java, Sumatra, and Borneo. But this is the part that's interesting, actually. There's a line drawn on here, and if you zoom in, it's a line between the islands. And in German, to the west, it says Asian fauna, animals from Asia. And to the right, it says Australian fauna, the animals from Australia. This is the Wallace line. Wallace was a contemporary of Darwin who noticed in the string of islands here that you start getting, you have monkeys, Asian monkeys up to a point, and they stop and the marsupials begin. That Australia and Asia were far apart during the evolution of a lot of these mammals, but as the islands popped up together, they haven't transferred all the way across. So the Wallace line is something in evolutionary biology where they talk about seeing the difference between these. And I always heard it called the Wallace line, but then I didn't realize that this map that had been hanging over the monitor my computer was actually older than that and had the same observation in it. It's not exactly in the same place, but it's the same idea. Like this strange island here, the lines on the other side. So the geometric space is stuff we usually we think about calculations in math. We're calculating distance, we're calculating proximity. Geographic space gives us the way to interpret the summaries and talk about place or the context of things around it as well as space. Geographic information systems allow us to layer these data sets together like those 7 layers of data that I showed before, but in public health, we might have a map of cases from the health department, a map of exposures from the EPA, and a map of population controls from the census. And by linking together by places, we can see how many cases are in what exposure zone and how many cases do we expect if everyone was equally at risk. So this is the kind of stuff David and I were working on a lot. You can also use the geographic information system. If you don't have measures of exposure, talk about how close something is. You make a buffer around a point, which would be circles, a buffer around an area, or a buffer around a line, like a stream segment that might be polluted. So one example is an environmental justice complaint that was filed in Flint, Michigan a long time ago. This is during the Bill Clinton administration. The city of Flint was, this is before the water problems they had, or probably before the water problems were detected. So I don't know if they were there or not. But it was an economically depressed area after the closure of auto plants. It was a proposal to build a steel plant there. And during the Clinton administration, a guidance from the EPA came out, a recommendation on how to use geographic information systems to look for environmental justice or differential impact by race or ethnicity or income. And there was a complaint filed with the EPA saying the vast majority of people within 3 miles of the proposed site are minority Americans who would be burdened with a disparate impact. The Detroit News, which was advocating for building the plant, was saying it's an overwhelmingly white makeup of the surrounding neighborhood demographics. They didn't give a distance, but if you dig in further, theirs was based on a 1 mile distance. So if you just if you think about the data as a map rather than these percentages reported by each group, you can see what's going on. The 1 mile district is a bit outside of town. It's more rural, and the percentage Black is very small. If you do the 3 mile radius, you're starting to include the city of Michigan, where there's more of a concentration of the Black population. And if you get to the 3 mile, then half the people in the circle, because there's a denser population and a higher minority, now it's 51%. And that was the argument for this. So both of the statements are true, but the argument in the press was louder and louder and louder and louder. And people were thinking one is right and one is wrong. Whereas a figure, a map like this would have made really clear what's going on right away. It wouldn't decide the issue, but at least you wouldn't be arguing about some of the data elements that went into it rather than talking about, do we want to do this or not? But not all interpretation, it's not like maps, once you put on a map that it's magic and all truth is revealed and the angels sing, because we've already seen examples with yellow fever and with the interpretation of Jon Snow's map that not all interpretations are correct. And that's where statistics comes in. We try to interpret what's the probability of one hypothesis versus another. So the last section I want to talk about are maps as statistics. And when you're doing inference in geographic space, statistical inference, a lot of our tools are based on independent, identically distributed observations where they have the same mean and the variance. And good things happen as we get more data. Like we learn more and more and more. And a lot of it's based on simple random sampling. In spatial data, it's not IID. We have spatial correlation. We often have different mean number of cases because there's more people or less people, and different variances. And then asymptotics, or even growing your sample size, is weird. Are you making your map bigger and bigger? Or are you keeping the same map and just watching it longer and longer and seeing more things happen? And different stuff happens if you do those two different types of asymptotics. And then sampling, sometimes we have a limited sampling budget. So where are we going to go take measurements? Do we just take a simple random sample? So we work with, or some of my students and I do some work with California Health Department wildlife biologists, and they trap ground squirrels and they look for bubonic plague, which circulates in the wild in the western US. It doesn't happen a lot, but there's not a lot of human cases, but it's bad if a person gets it. So they want to know, are campsites, are there rodents nearby? So they have a limited budget. Where should they go sample? They can't do a simple random sample of the whole state because most of it will be negative. So they probably go where they've seen it before. They go where it would be really bad if it happens. Let's go to Yosemite, let's go to other places. And then they have some exploratory. So can I do some statistics to say, here's a smarter way to sample your risk area to learn more? And that's the kind of project we've been working on. So I want to talk about 3 examples. The first one I'll spend a little more time than the second one. So don't panic after I finish that one. The other 2 are going to be that long, okay? So this is where I have some equations. Small area estimation. A lot of you, I've talked to people today talking about using random effects for longitudinal and borrowing information. And I want to set this up. And the reason we're doing some of these statistical methods is there's a tension between geographic precision, having a map with a lot of small areas, there's a lot of detail, and a map with statistical precision where you want a big sample size for each measurement. So if I make all my areas small, there's fewer and fewer observations, and those confidence intervals get really wide. Now it's mostly noise. If I start pooling them into bigger areas, I get really precise answers over the whole Southeast, and that doesn't tell me a whole lot of specifics. And the way we implement this in our models are we use regression type models or generalized linear models with random effects, and we use priors and penalties. And I want to say there's some statistical insights on some bigger statistical issues that are motivated by these maps. The second one is spatially varying associations, where if you fit a model, a regression model, what if that association is different in different places? What if it's a positive association for the people sitting over on this side of the room? It's a negative association over there. Can that happen? And the last one is, we're used to looking at residual plots and things. What if we made those maps? And if we calculate statistical power to detect a cluster of disease, what if that cluster happened on the right-hand side of the room versus the left-hand? I always have the same power of finding it. So the geographical statistical precision, I said geographic precision wants a map with lots of detail with small regions. Statistical precision wants maps with a lot of collections of observations, large ones. And then privacy is, if I have a really detailed geographic one, there's only one case in a neighborhood, I might know who that is. So I have an easier chance of discovering the one outlier in a smaller group. So there's kind of a triangle here. Statistical accuracy and geographical accuracy. If we pool information, we get more statistical accuracy because our sample size goes up. If we pool less information, we get geographical accuracy. And we're trying to find some perfect balance, the Goldilocks amount here. That I want to borrow information from my neighbors without losing my own information. This is a bias trade-off. The way these models often work is we have people sitting in the room in kind of a grid, If I gave each of you an envelope and you open the envelope and it has 3 numbers in it, and I tell you that's the temperature at your seat, can you raise your hand like a human thermometer that high? And you want to be the smart kid in the room, you average those really fast and you put your hand up. And then you look at the people beside you and their hands are all a little lower than yours. You're going to do this. You're going to adjust, like maybe I was too fast because temperature's not going to jump that much. At the same time, they're looking at yours and they go up a little bit. So they're combining information from their envelope and what your answer was to try to smooth the surface. The highest highs come lower, the lowest lows go up. We don't completely make the information go away, but we try to compromise with what we see next to us. That's what these methods are doing with math, is the Bayesian model picks kind of the right amount of information to borrow. This is a field called disease mapping. It's also, the older version of it is small area estimation, and that can also be, and when you're making contingency tables and subdividing subgroups and they get smaller and smaller, the same kind of idea can happen. More recently, what the census and other groups are doing is the same issue with statistical accuracy versus privacy. So you might add some noise to give privacy, but then you lose your statistical accuracy of your neighbor. And if you inject less noise, you get more statistical accuracy, but less privacy protection. And the 2020 census used a formal procedure called differential privacy on how to add noise to this and make sure you don't have negative people living in an area. But with 3,000 counties and each of those counties containing multiple census tracts, there's going to be some weirdness in this where you have, more kids living there than are enrolled in schools. And so on. So there's been a lot of controversy and discussion about the differential privacy application. And the bottom idea of differential privacy locally and borrowing, that hasn't been done as much. But global or geographical differential privacy is kind of an area of current statistical interest. So the small area estimation has been around since the late 70s. Fay and Harriet used a theoretical result called James Stein estimation to give a compromise between your local estimate, your hand by yourself, and your neighbor, and everyone's. You move kind of to the average of the room. The local version of just looking at your neighbors came out in the late 80s, early 90s, and is a compromise between the local estimate and neighbors, or you can actually do both. You can adjust to your neighbors and to everybody. And it's a classic design modeling hybrid. You design what you can to collect good data, and then you add models to get the rest. And it's usually implemented using something called a random effect or a random intercept. And I want to spend a couple of slides talking about how I understand how random effects work, because I applied them a long time, but nobody explained, well, I wasn't paying attention in class when they were explaining why we did this. So I had to figure it out on my own. So maybe I'm going to save several of you years of wandering in the wilderness. And besides, I have this desperate need for things to make sense. I want to have some intuition. I don't know that everyone will leave with intuition, but I'll try. Oh, no, I've lost everyone already. Sorry. For those who've taken the classes on Poisson regression, the usual Poisson regression is the expected value of the number of cases in a region is modeled with a linear model. That's the red part. That's like a regression model, plus an intercept value that goes with every region has its own intercept. So each region's expected count starts at the overall estimate plus their local adjustment. And these local adjustments follow a distribution across all the regions. And this can be spatial, like your adjustment to your neighbor, your disease risk might be similar to the one next to you. And the distribution is, when you put the model in this way, what happens to your estimate is you end up borrowing information. The structure of the random effects tells the model how to adjust its prediction for your risk based on the other predictions. And so it combines some information from them and information from your own data. And it gives you and by doing this, it gives you the right amount, according to the model, the right amount of information to borrow. So it's a mathematical way of that fudging. It's a mathematical fudge factor, or a mathematical elegant feature to the model. Now, when we do statistical inference, I think about this in 3 different components. There's a conceptual frame, that's the framework for intuition and inference. We're trying to turn the bugs in the model, spatial correlation, or I have a small local sample size, into a feature. So I say, I want to borrow from my neighbors. That's the concept here. The implementation is how we calculate and compute it, and that's where we take data observations and turn them into inference and conclusions using data, methods, and algorithms. And then we have to interpret things like, is it biased, confounded? How do we visualize this? How do we communicate what the outcome of our model means? So those are all 3 different things. They're all interrelated, and they're all part of what we do as statisticians. In spatial statistics, we use likelihood functions a lot, like we do in a lot of statistics, and we use Bayesian inference. The random effects fit into the Bayesian model pretty well, and it tells us how we smooth things out. But a lot of times we're putting that random effect distribution in as a prior, and I want to make a contrast between two different kinds of priors. In Bayesian statistics, there's priors, that's what you think the parameter value is before you see any data. I think it might range between small and large. But the models we do on random effects are a little different. I want my model to have spatial correlation, so I'm going to put a spatial prior on that random effect. Or in longitudinal analysis, I want to borrow over time, so I have a prior telling me how much to borrow over time. And so, so there's prior, that's a good idea. It's like, oh, I can build these things into my model. But ever since Bayes' paper in 1763, priors bothered people. Part of the time is because the scientific side is I don't want to say what I think it is. I want the data to speak for itself. Okay, so that might be legitimate, and we try to have informational priors that don't change the answer. But if we want to make the model do something, we might put in a structure that makes it happen. So this is Thomas Bayes' essay towards solving, that's the old style S's. So this is Bayes, and here's me and Bayes. I can't take a good selfie, and that's his tomb in London. But one of the things that made me click on this, because there's other people who say I don't want to be a Bayesian, but I'm going to use penalized likelihood functions or something. But I was reading 5 different papers that analyzed space-time clusters in the same Florida data, and one of them, this is in 2014, I read, and the main thing is I got to one of their equations down here, and it had absolute values of the difference of my 2 random intercepts. And usually in the spatial models, we have that squared because that turns into a normal distribution and good things follow. But this one had an absolute value, and I thought, oh wait, I've seen this before. And I don't remember every detail from everything I read, but this other paper by Julian Bisag also had the straight lines here and not the square. So something else had been here before, but this paper was saying I'm doing a lasso penalty, and this was saying I'm doing a prior. And I was trying to figure out how the two of them work. And then I realized they're kind of the same thing. You have a penalty, that's a structural prior. You're saying I'm penalizing things so that they'll have this feature. I'm doing it in another way. So in a little more detail, do you have to be a Bayesian to use random effects? No. But let's think about this. That sounds like I think you really have to be. So the posterior distribution is what all Bayesian inference is based on. It's a product of 4 things. This x given the variable, this is the likelihood function. For those of you who aren't keen on likelihood functions, you can just wait a minute and I'll be done with this in a second. There's a likelihood function, and here the random effects are the thetas. The random effect distribution, it has a variance. Then I have an informational prior about the betas, and I have something about the hyperprior of the random variable. So I have 4, my inference is based on the product of 4 things. And a Bayesian would say A is the conditionally independent likelihood, B and C are priors, and D is a hyperprior. And we base our inference on this. A classical statistician would say, oh, no. A times B is the likelihood, because if you're using a random effect in a classical statistics way, you have to fold that correlation in to really define your likelihood, to maximize that and do your asymptotics. A penalized likelihood would say, oh, no, AB is the likelihood with a penalty. But all of them are using A times B. So we're trying to create structure in our model to have certain kinds of correlation in order to borrow the information from the data. So A times B is mathematically identical by all 3 of these paradigms, but what you do is different. What you do next is different. The Bayesian would say, I'm defining my random effects distribution, that's a structural prior, and then I try to find the posterior distribution, the product of those 4 things, and I can use Markov chain Monte Carlo, Hamiltonian Monte Carlo, in-law, something like that. Classical statistician would say, tell me your random effects distribution, and that gives me a complicated correlated likelihood A times B. Now I want to use advanced optimization to find the peak, and I'll use asymptotic inference to get the variation. And so the cool part of the problem for them is solving the asymptotics and the optimization. And they think the Bayesian brushed that all aside and just relied on Markov chain Monte Carlo. Penalized likelihood would define B to penalize the unwanted values to kind of zero them out. And interesting, I'm saying the A times B is identical. So if you're a Bayesian or a classical or you're a penalized likelihood person, if one of you gets a wildly different answer than the other one, there's some other assumption in here, not which one you chose. So I think if we argue over which way to do inference, it's more an argument over what you want to learn the same thing from the data. So what else can we do? Let me give one slide of each of these. Spatially varying associations. Standard statistical models assume independence, constant variance, Gaussian errors, and linear association between the mean and the covariance. What if we break the first three rules? That makes me sound really rebellious. It's really rock and roll here. So two ways that we model this, we can fix it by using weighted least squares for unequal variance, and we can add geographic weights for geographically weighted regression. So I basically start on this side of the room and I give high weight to the data for these people, fit a regression. Then I move over a little bit and give high weight to the same umbrella, but it's like now I've included a little bit more data. It's not that different, but it's going to shift some. And I go across the room and I fit locally that way. Or I can build a model where I build these priors on trying to smooth the slopes as well. So David worked with us on some violence in census tracts in Houston. And we had total alcohol sales, drug arrests, and a couple of the census tracts had very few people in them. But we tried to compare these two approaches of fixing it and modeling it. And we get sort of similar patterns, but not quite the same. The geographically weighted regression one was very smooth, and you see some differences that the alcohol sales had some concentrations, and the drug arrests had a pattern where it was stronger association in the suburbs than in the city. We did a similar thing in that raccoons paper, so you recognize this map. I hope you do, but we looked at the association with rivers and saw this high blue area, which meant we did pages and calculations to try to get to the fact of what we saw in this at the beginning, that it was faster between these two and then slowed down. And the last thing I want to talk about with David working with me on maps was the spatial diagnostics for spatial models. So we have spatial models, we get diagnostics, but I want to make a map of these. So the kind of diagnostics we do in statistics are we do something called residuals, or we measure how well our model fits using deviance information criteria, Aki-Iki information criteria, Bayesian, and these different ones. We might use statistical power to talk about how well a detection technique, detecting a cluster is, sensitivity, specificity, but what if these vary by location? What if I have better power to find a cluster over here than over there? And in kind of 2020 hindsight, that makes sense. If I have a city over here and have a whole lot of people, I'm going to have higher power to detect the same increase. So I had a student where we looked at Santa Clara County, California, and we were checking how some new methods worked compared to some old methods, and the data set we were using from the old paper had a contaminated water well. And we ran a bunch of simulations and we got the power of finding it, and then found out we had the well in the wrong place. It was still on our map, but it was in the wrong place. I said, oh, just rerun it. She reran it and everything changed. I said, okay, rerun it on a grid of places, which is a very advisor type thing to do. It sounds like, oh, that won't take long, will it? So she carefully ran all those, and we found that it had higher power to detect the same increase in risk in areas with more people. So in a way, we should have known that before we started, but now we had maps of it. And so that was one of our best titles ever, was Power, Geography of Power. And then David helped me. This is a map of a part of Rwanda. It looks like India, but it's not. It's this part here. And we were looking at HIV infection in different sections in this Butari area with some people at the Centers for Disease Control. And the HIV infection geographically varies. There's a university town here and an army base. And we were trying to figure out what the drivers of that were. We had several local, there was like percentage sex workers, income, education level. But one of the things we were trying to find is maybe the association's stronger in the cities than it is somewhere else. So David came up with an idea of the deviance information criteria is an overall measure of fit. There's a value for every subregion. You add it up to get how well your model fits. But we said, what if we mapped all the pieces we're adding up? And then he showed that the areas that really drove this were all in this concentrated area where a highway runs. And we made a plot of the high values. And so it was identifying those observations which were driving the story, and then us trying to decide if that's the story we wanted to conclude from the whole thing or just that part. So in summary, maps fascinate us. They motivate these questions. They drive stories. They communicate and give us a geographic context for our observed variations. They integrate data into combined data elements that have geographic space and geometric space, so we can do the calculations on those. And then once they're combined, it provides input to the mathematics that we do to draw inference in geographic space. We interpret it in geographic space, explain it on a map, and we decide how well our model fits on a geographic space, not just does it fit well or not. And that's where we'll end up with here be dragons. The only map in the world that says here be dragons is a little globe about the size of a softball, this Hunt Lennox globe. And here's where it says it. And that's in China. So maybe it makes sense that it was more about the stories told than an idea of a medieval map saying, ooh, it's scary here, there's a dragon. Medieval maps say here are lions that they were scared for. So I will, there's an online version of this that you can rotate around, and it's pretty cool. So thank you very much for your time and patience. And yes. I don't think they built it, but I should follow up. Well, so two parts of the story. With respect to the mini mill, I don't recall if it went through. With respect to the use of the guidance, all the appropriation bills for the EPA following that were saying anyone using this guidance will result in EPA not being funded. So it's some political, I don't know if that's still in the appropriation bill for many years after that. So a couple of things, a court case went forward. There was a pushback about using the geographic information systems to try to find associations to point forward, rather than, oh, this can explain what's going on. So, Flint is a complicated situation, both in terms of employment and economy. A lot had changed, and now with the water issue. So I should go back and find out what the eventual result of it was, but there was a big push by the state. So I'm not surprised if it would have been built, but I don't recall. But yeah, thanks for asking that. But it's a good question. Yeah.
Ever encountered a situation where actually displaying the map that you want either extremely challenging, either statistically, perhaps politically motivated?
Yeah. So the question is whether we found a situation where displaying the map is challenging for either statistical or political reasons, and I think that, to me, it goes to that communication element. The map tells a story, but the map often can't capture everything about it. So, but it may be the only thing they look at. So there's this back and forth. You want the map to hold, it's similar to the transit maps. You want it to show the information. You want it to accurately show that. And you also want it to not distract from too much else. So I find in some statistical mapping, people make the map and just go. It's the same as making a graph. And I think there's more to it. The choice of colors can matter, the description of what you include. And I think you want to give, especially in a figure at a paper, I'm more of a proponent of the longer caption because someone might not read the body of the paper. So I want them, if they got that by itself and read this, I'd want them to have as complete a picture of that as I could. But the details for filling in and motivating it would be also written there. So it can be challenging. I think the main thing for us to remember is once the map's done, the communication's not done. And trying to figure out how to package it in a way to share it to a variety of audiences, because maps are also a really common communicator. And if I have a map and then 8 pages of the Greek letters to explain it, I've limited my audience to a bunch of specialists. And sometimes that's what I'm after. So I'm trying to compare something, but for the most part, when I get back to the conclusion, I have to come full circle back and say, what question did I answer? And how's that similar to what motivated us to start? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, in the back. Yeah. Yeah.
My question is, I think that it's like I guess that one is sort of different. Are there more Forms of maps that you work with that are necessary geographic.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so the question is that this map on the left, the Marshall Island shell chart, has kind of an abstracted distance. Distance is time. Are there other abstracted distance we've done? And so part of the plague work we worked on in California. So we had point locations of coyotes that had been sampled, and they were seropositive or seronegative to plague. And so their coyotes are like living the life of plague detectors. The problem is they don't stay put. But we have blue dots and we have red dots, positive and negative, or negative and positive, hot and cold. And at each point on the map, we also have climate variables like elevation and rainfall and humidity, average humidity, and things like that. And we wanted to know, is there a habitat type associated with this higher seropositivity? And we had a lot of methods for taking the blue dots and red dots and figuring out if they're clustered in California. But what we did is take all those climate variables, temperature variables, landscape variables, and do a principal component, like what are the two, and the two directions tended to be temperature and rainfall. And we moved all of the dots into that space. So distance there is how similar, if they're close together, they have a similar habitat. If they're far apart, it's different. And we found the clustering there, and the two were separated. And we drew a boundary around the positive areas that were more highly positive. Well, we made a whole surface of the risk of a possibility of it being positive or negative. And that surface is now made up of all the dots of California, and we moved them all back. We made a map of California of the areas with higher relative risk of plague and lower relative risk of plague. And we get a map that lines up pretty well with what their expectations were based on the history, but also identified some areas that had similar. They had like the plague phenotype for the type of environment that they hadn't looked before. So it gave them some information on where to look, not like, oh my gosh, there's definitely a plague here. It's just saying this has all the indicators that the places where you found plague do too. So you can add it to your list. And we wanted to be really clear on this when we were working with them, that a lot of academics will say, give me your plague data, and they do a bunch of magic with mathematics, and they draw a map with red spots on it and go, that's where plague is. And then that goes to the newspaper, and now they have to take their time away from sampling to answering the newspaper questions of, we haven't seen any plague here. How come you're hiding this from us? So we said, we want to communicate it to you as, and so that was a challenge of the map we had. It took us a long time to figure out how to describe it, so it didn't say, this is an area with a really high risk of plague. And so this is an area with the markers similar to areas with higher, it's harder to say. And trying to get that clear. So that was a different distance. The space we were working in was the climate space as opposed to the geographic space. But we wanted to bring it back to California, to the geographic space, so they could do their work. So yeah, it's a good question, but there's different spaces and versions of this that I think can be, and you could also think of the space of social determinants of health. Areas with similar income, similar housing types, similar housing ages, lead paint, that those houses might be closer together, or travel distance. New York's closer to San Francisco than it is to Bismarck, North Dakota. In some sense, like more people pass through there for an infectious disease. So there are also variations where you warp the space to do that, but you kind of lose the impact of the map. Yeah, good question. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Then somehow we won't remove the value information in the equation. I guess you can find the clusters, so you get clusters, and we will find the characteristics of it. And like you said.
No, so the question is, how do you go from things you see on the map to what's in the equation? That condenses it a little bit. It's not catch everything, but do you go from clusters to what's similar? And one of the choices you have to make in modeling is, are you trying to model the mean, say, risk of cancer, or are you trying to model the correlation nearby? Because the correlation nearby helps us fit the model better, but it also often doesn't explain how the risk changes. So I would much rather get back to a model where I had independence and independent observation. So I tend to use the spatial part as again, a mathematically fancy fudge factor to get better estimates. But if I have covariates there, I would rather explain what's going on with covariates. These are risk factors. Is this due to the air pollution, or is it associated with the water quality? Is it associated with the age of the housing? I would much rather have that because I think those are things I could act on in the future. Where if I said I have a better estimate just because it was next to another high rate, that might help in an infection component in a time window, but it also doesn't give me as much insight onto how the risk goes up and down. So I tend to, on the nature versus nurture kind of thing, I want to know what it is about this area that makes it high. And if I can measure several things, but not everything, that residual spatial or autocorrelation might help my model fit better. But yeah, rather than trying to model it all with correlations. Thanks.
Give us an end here, but
Yep.
before we go, we have a little gift for
Oh,
you, just
thanks.
to acknowledge your contributions
Great.
to spatial statistics and in memory of David. So
Great.
thank
Thanks.
you for
It
being
means
here.
a
Really
lot.
enjoyed your
Yeah.
talk.
Thanks very much.
All right, thank you.
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
We'll get from the first hour.
Yeah, of course. As long as they're mine.
That's right.